The morning air in Camp Pendleton was thick with tension as Colonel Marcus Hayes adjusted his uniform for the third time. Today wasn't just another briefing day. Today, General Patricia Kellerman was arriving to personally oversee the selection of volunteers for Operation Silent Thunder, a classified mission that had the entire base walking on eggshells. Private First Class Danny Morrison sat behind his metal desk in the administration building, methodically typing incident reports into the computer system. At 22 years old, Danny had been assigned to desk duty for the past 8 months after a training accident left him with a permanent limp in his right leg. Most soldiers saw desk work as punishment, but Danny found strange comfort in the routine. Numbers made sense. Paperwork had clear rules. Unlike the chaos of combat training, administrative work never shot back. The administration building buzzed with unusual activity. Officers rushed past Danny's desk without their usual nods of acknowledgement. Phones rang constantly, and hushed conversations filled every corner. Danny had learned to read the base's moods through these small details. Something big was happening. Morrison, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, called from across the room. General Kellerman wants all personnel files for Bravo Company ready in 30 minutes. Make sure they're alphabetized and cross-referenced with recent performance reviews. Danny nodded and immediately began pulling files. His fingers moved quickly through the filing cabinets, a skill he developed during months of administrative work. While other soldiers complained about paperwork, Danny had discovered he possessed an unusual talent for organization and detail. He could spot inconsistencies in reports that others missed, remember regulation numbers without looking them up, and organize complex information systems that made everyone's job easier. As he worked, Danny overheard fragments of conversation from the officers' meeting room next door. The mission required volunteers with specific qualifications: advanced marksmanship training, wilderness survival certification, psychological stability under extreme pressure. Most importantly, someone willing to operate completely alone behind enemy lines for up to 3 weeks. General Kellerman arrived at precisely 0900 hours. Danny watched through the window as her convoy pulled up to the main building. She was exactly as the stories described her: tall, imposing, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail around her. Kellerman had earned her reputation during 2 decades of special operations before transitioning to command roles. Soldiers respected her because she never asked anyone to do something she hadn't already done herself. The briefing room filled quickly with the base's most elite soldiers. Danny could see them through the glass partition: Rangers, Special Forces veterans, Marines with combat decorations covering their chests. These were men who had proven themselves in Afghanistan, Iraq, and countless classified operations around the world. Sergeant Michael "Tank" Thompson dominated one corner of the room. At 6 feet 4 inches and 240 pounds of pure muscle, Tank had earned his nickname during basic training by literally punching through a wooden barrier during obstacle course training. His record showed 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, and commendations for valor in combat. Everyone expected Tank to volunteer for whatever mission General Kellerman had in mind. Danny continued his filing work, but his attention kept drifting to the meeting. Through years of administrative duty, he developed the ability to appear busy while actually listening to conversations happening around him. It was a survival skill in an environment where information meant everything. General Kellerman's voice carried through the thin walls as she began her presentation. Gentlemen, what I'm about to share with you is classified at the highest levels. 3 weeks ago, satellite intelligence identified a terrorist cell operating from a compound in the mountains of northern Afghanistan. This isn't just any terrorist group. These individuals have been responsible for attacks on American interests across 3 countries, and our intelligence suggests they're planning something significantly larger. Danny's typing slowed as he strained to hear more details. The mission, as Kellerman described it, involved inserting a single operative into hostile territory to gather intelligence and, if possible, eliminate the leadership structure of the terrorist cell. The operative would have no backup, no extraction plan, and no communication with base for the duration of the mission. This is what we call a black operation, Kellerman continued. If something goes wrong, the United States government will deny any knowledge of your existence. Your families will be told you died in a training accident. There will be no medal ceremony, no recognition, no acknowledgement of your sacrifice. You will quite literally disappear. The room fell silent. Danny had stopped typing entirely now, his hands frozen above the keyboard. This was the kind of mission that ended careers one way or another. Either you came back a ghost, or you didn't come back at all. I need one volunteer, Kellerman said. One person willing to spend 3 weeks alone in some of the most dangerous territory on Earth, with nothing but their training and their will to survive. Danny expected immediate responses. These were elite soldiers, men who had volunteered for dangerous missions throughout their careers. But the silence stretched on uncomfortably. Even through the wall, Danny could feel the weight of the general's words settling over the assembled soldiers. Finally, Tank Thompson cleared his throat. "Ma'am, what are the specific qualifications for this mission?" Kellerman's response was crisp and detailed. Advanced wilderness survival training. Expert-level marksmanship with multiple weapon systems. Psychological evaluation indicating stability under isolation stress. Physical conditioning to operate at peak efficiency while carrying minimal supplies. Most importantly, the ability to think independently and adapt to changing situations without guidance from command. Danny knew Tank met every single qualification. His file, which Danny had processed numerous updates for over the past months, read like a special operations dream. Tank had survived 18 months in the mountains of Afghanistan during his last deployment. His marksmanship scores consistently ranked in the top 1% of all military personnel. His psychological evaluations always came back with phrases like exceptionally stable under pressure and thrives in high-stress environments. But Tank didn't volunteer. Neither did Staff Sergeant Williams, whose record showed similar qualifications, or Master Sergeant Clerk, who had led 3 successful deep reconnaissance missions in hostile territory. The silence continued for several long minutes. Danny could hear chairs shifting and men clearing their throats, but no one spoke up. Finally, General Kellerman's voice cut through the tension with obvious disappointment. "Gentlemen, I am surprised. When I reviewed the personnel files for this base, I expected multiple volunteers for a mission of this importance. Are you telling me that among the finest soldiers in the United States military, not one person is willing to step forward?" More silence. Danny could picture the scene in the briefing room. Hardened combat veterans staring at their boots, avoiding eye contact with one of the most respected generals in the military. These were men who had charged in a gunfire without hesitation, but something about this mission had given them all pause. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at Danny's desk, interrupting his eavesdropping. "Morrison, I need you to run these files over to Building C. Colonel Hayes wants them in his office in 10 minutes. Danny gathered the stack of personnel files and headed toward the door. As he walked past the briefing room, he glanced through the window and saw exactly what he had imagined. 24 elite soldiers sitting in uncomfortable silence while General Kellerman stood at the front of the room, clearly frustrated by their lack of response. The walk to Building C took Danny across the main parade ground, where he encountered several groups of soldiers discussing the mysterious briefing. Word traveled fast on military bases, and everyone knew something important was happening, even if they didn't know the specific details. "I heard it's some kind of suicide mission," one soldier was saying to his friend. "That's why nobody volunteered." Tank Thompson turned it down. Another soldier added, "If Tank won't do it, it must be really bad." Danny delivered the files to Colonel Hayes' office and began the walk back to the administration building. As he crossed the parade ground again, he saw General Kellerman emerge from the briefing room, clearly agitated. She stood outside the building for several minutes, apparently making phone calls on her secure communication device. Back at his desk, Danny tried to focus on his regular duties, but his mind kept returning to the briefing. He had spent 8 months processing files for every soldier on the base. He knew their qualifications, their psychological evaluations, their combat records. More importantly, he had read between the lines of those official documents to understand who these men really were. Tank Thompson was an exceptional soldier, but Danny had noticed patterns in his psychological evaluations that others missed. Tank thrived in high-pressure situations, but only when he had clear orders and defined objectives. The mission General Kellerman described required someone who could operate without guidance, someone comfortable making life-or-death decisions alone. Tank's strength was following orders perfectly, not improvising when plans fell apart. Staff Sergeant Williams had impressive survival training, but his medical records showed a history of minor anxiety issues when separated from his unit for extended periods. Master Sergeant Clerk was tactically brilliant, but his performance reviews consistently mentioned his tendency to rely on technology and communication with command to make strategic decisions. Danny realized that General Kellerman wasn't just looking for the most decorated soldier or the person with the most impressive combat record. She needed someone with a very specific psychological profile, someone who could function independently, adapt to unexpected situations, and remain mentally stable while completely cut off from support systems. As these thoughts swirled through his mind, Danny became aware of a growing commotion in the briefing room next door. Voices were raised, and he could hear General Kellerman speaking in a sharp tone that usually preceded someone getting demoted. "Gentlemen, I've spent the last hour on the phone with Pentagon officials explaining why none of the elite soldiers at this base are willing to volunteer for a critical national security mission. Do you understand what that does to the reputation of this unit? Do you comprehend the implications of telling senior leadership that our most highly trained operatives are unwilling to serve when their country needs them most?" Danny heard chairs scraping against the floor as soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Through the wall, Tank Thompson's distinctive voice responded, "Ma'am, it's not that we're unwilling to serve, but this mission as described has a very low probability of success. We're trained to complete objectives, not to disappear in the mountains on what amounts to a reconnaissance mission with no clear extraction plan." "Sergeant Thompson," Kellerman replied coldly, "are you suggesting that I haven't properly evaluated the risks and benefits of this operation? Are you questioning the intelligence assessment that led to this mission being authorized at the highest levels of government?" "No, ma'am. I'm simply stating that sometimes discretion is the better part of valor. A dead soldier accomplishes nothing for his country." The exchange continued for several more minutes, with General Kellerman growing increasingly frustrated and the assembled soldiers becoming more defensive. Danny had witnessed similar situations before where pride and protocol prevented honest communication between ranks. The soldiers weren't cowards, but they also weren't going to volunteer for what they perceived as an impossible mission just to satisfy a general's expectations. Finally, Danny heard Kellerman dismiss the group with obvious disgust. "You're all dismissed. I'll be making recommendations to your commanding officers regarding this situation. Sergeant Thompson, Staff Sergeant Williams, Master Sergeant Clerk. I want to see your complete service records on my desk within the hour." The soldiers filed out of the briefing room, none of them making eye contact with General Kellerman as they passed. Danny watched through the window as she stood alone, clearly trying to decide her next course of action. For several minutes, she paced back and forth, occasionally checking her phone and making what appeared to be increasingly frustrated calls to her superiors. Danny found himself in an unusual position. For 8 months, he had been essentially invisible on the base. Desk clerks weren't supposed to have opinions about military operations, and soldiers with permanent injuries weren't expected to volunteer for dangerous missions. But as he sat at his desk, reviewing the personnel files he had been working with all morning, Danny began to realize something that General Kellerman apparently didn't understand. She was looking in the wrong place for her volunteer. The mission she had described required someone who could operate independently, adapt to changing circumstances, and remain psychologically stable under extreme isolation. Those qualifications didn't necessarily correlate with combat decorations or special forces training. In fact, some of the psychological traits that made soldiers effective in elite units might actually be counterproductive for this specific mission. Danny had spent months observing the soldiers on base, processing their files, reading their psychological evaluations, and watching how they responded to different types of stress. He had developed an understanding of military psychology that went beyond official records and training scores. More importantly, Danny had discovered during his 8 months of desk duty that he possessed several qualities that might be uniquely suited to the mission General Kellerman described. His administrative work had required him to function independently for hours at a time, making decisions about complex problems without guidance from superiors. His permanent injury had forced him to develop mental resilience and the ability to find solutions when physical capabilities were limited. Most importantly, 8 months of being essentially ignored by the base's elite soldiers had given him a kind of psychological independence that came from having nothing to prove to anyone. As Danny continued to process these thoughts, General Kellerman emerged from the briefing room and walked directly toward the administration area. She moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had made a decision, though Danny couldn't imagine what options remained available to her. "Excuse me," she said, stopping at Danny's desk. "I need to review all personnel files for soldiers who have been assigned to administrative duties in the past year. I want to see anyone who might have relevant qualifications that weren't considered for today's briefing." Danny looked up at her, meeting her eyes for the first time. General Kellerman was even more intimidating up close, but there was something in her expression that suggested she was genuinely searching for solutions rather than simply trying to intimidate subordinates. "Ma'am, I can pull those files for you immediately," Danny replied. "But if I may ask, what specific qualifications are you looking for? It might help me identify the most relevant personnel records." Kellerman studied Danny for a moment, apparently surprised to be engaged in actual conversation by a desk clerk. "I need someone who can function independently under extreme stress. Someone who doesn't require constant validation or guidance from superiors. Someone who can adapt to unexpected situations and make critical decisions without access to command structure." As she spoke, Danny realized that she was essentially describing the exact qualities he had developed during his 8 months of administrative duty. But he also knew that volunteering directly would be presumptuous and potentially career-ending. Instead, he decided to approach the situation from a different angle. "Ma'am, I've processed psychological evaluations for most personnel on this base. If you're looking for soldiers who demonstrate independence and adaptability, the files might not tell the complete story. Sometimes the most qualified person isn't the one with the most impressive combat record." General Kellerman's expression shifted slightly, showing the first sign of genuine interest she had displayed all morning. "What do you mean by that, soldier?" Danny chose his words carefully. Elite soldiers are trained to excel within specific parameters. They follow orders perfectly and execute complex plans under pressure. But this mission sounds like it requires someone who can operate outside normal parameters, someone comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. "And you think you know someone like that?" Danny met her eyes again, feeling the weight of a decision that could change everything about his military career. "Ma'am, I think you might be looking in the wrong place for your volunteer." General Kellerman pulled up a chair and sat down across from Danny's desk, clearly intrigued by this unexpected conversation. For the next hour, they discussed the mission requirements in detail, with Danny asking questions that demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that surprised even him. By the end of their conversation, General Kellerman had made a decision that would shock everyone on the base. General Kellerman stood up from her chair and walked to the window, staring out at the parade ground where groups of soldiers continued their daily training routines. Danny remained silent, sensing that she was processing their conversation and weighing options he couldn't fully understand. "Private Morrison," she said finally, turning back toward his desk. "I want you to report to Conference Room B at 1,400 hours for additional evaluation. Bring your complete service record and psychological evaluation files." Danny felt his heart rate increase. "Ma'am, evaluation for what purpose?" That will be explained during the evaluation, Kellerman replied. Until then, you're not to discuss our conversation with anyone. Is that clear? Yes, ma'am. After General Kellerman left, Danny tried to focus on his regular administrative duties, but concentration proved impossible. The next 3 hours passed slowly, with Danny alternately questioning his judgment and trying to prepare himself for whatever evaluation awaited him. At precisely 1,400 hours, Danny reported to Conference Room B, carrying a folder containing his service records. The room contained a long table with General Kellerman seated at one end and 2 other officers he didn't recognize sitting along the sides. The setup reminded him uncomfortably of a court-martial proceeding. "Private Morrison, please take a seat," General Kellerman said, gesturing toward the chair at the opposite end of the table. "These are Major Sarah Chun from Psychological Operations and Colonel James Mitchell from Special Activities Division. They're here to conduct an assessment." Danny sat down and placed his service folder on the table. Major Chun was a petite woman with sharp eyes and the kind of calm demeanor that suggested extensive experience evaluating soldiers under stress. Colonel Mitchell appeared to be in his 50s, with graying temples and the weathered look of someone who had spent significant time in combat zones. "Private Morrison," Major Chun began, "General Kellerman has shared your conversation from this morning, including your assessment of why conventional Special Forces personnel might not be ideally suited for this particular mission. We'd like to explore your reasoning in more detail." For the next hour, the 3 officers subjected Danny to the most thorough psychological evaluation he had ever experienced. They asked questions about his decision-making process, his comfort level with uncertainty, his ability to function independently, and his psychological response to stress and isolation. Major Chun was particularly interested in Danny's adaptation to desk duty following his training accident. Most soldiers view administrative assignment as a form of punishment or failure. How did you process that transition? Danny considered the question carefully. "Ma'am, initially I was disappointed and frustrated. I had trained to be a combat soldier, and suddenly I was filing paperwork. But after a few weeks, I began to realize that administrative work requires different skills that are actually quite challenging. You have to manage complex information systems, make decisions about priorities when everything seems urgent, and solve problems that don't have clear solutions in the manual. And you found satisfaction in that type of work." "Yes, ma'am. I discovered that I have a talent for seeing patterns and connections that others miss. When you process hundreds of personnel files, you start to understand how different personality types respond to various types of stress and challenge. You learn to read between the lines of official reports and understand what's really happening with individual soldiers." Colonel Mitchell leaned forward, clearly interested. "Give me an example of a pattern you've observed that others missed." Danny thought for a moment, then referenced several cases where he had identified soldiers experiencing psychological stress based on subtle changes in their performance reports and medical records. In each case, his observations had been validated when the soldiers eventually sought counseling or medical attention. "Impressive," Mitchell said. "It sounds like you've developed analytical skills that go well beyond typical administrative training." The evaluation continued with increasingly complex scenarios. They presented Danny with hypothetical situations involving isolation, resource scarcity, and decision-making under extreme pressure. They tested his knowledge of survival techniques, his understanding of enemy tactics, and his ability to think strategically about complex problems. To Danny's surprise, he found himself enjoying the intellectual challenge. The questions required him to draw upon not just his military training, but also the observational skills and analytical thinking he had developed during months of administrative work. "Private Morrison," General Kellerman said finally, "we're going to step outside for a few minutes to discuss your evaluation. Please remain here." Danny sat alone in the conference room, trying to process what had just happened. The evaluation had felt less like a test and more like a comprehensive analysis of his psychological profile and problem-solving abilities. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being considered for something far beyond his current qualifications or experience. 20 minutes later, the three officers returned. General Kellerman sat down and looked directly at Danny with an expression he couldn't read. "Private Morrison, based on our evaluation, we believe you possess certain qualifications that make you uniquely suited for the mission I described this morning. However, I need to be completely honest about what we're asking you to consider." She proceeded to provide Danny with details about the mission that went far beyond what she had shared with the elite soldiers earlier. The terrorist cell was located in a remote mountain compound that satellite imagery suggested was heavily fortified and well-defended. Intelligence indicated the presence of at least 30 armed militants, sophisticated communication equipment, and possible surface-to-air missile systems. The operative we insert will have to approach the compound undetected, gather intelligence about the group's leadership structure and future plans, and if possible, eliminate key personnel to disrupt their operations. All of this while completely cut off from support and with no guaranteed extraction. Danny listened to the briefing with growing understanding of why none of the experienced soldiers had volunteered. This wasn't just a difficult mission. It was almost certainly a one-way trip. "Ma'am," Danny said when she finished, "you're describing a mission that seems designed for someone with extensive special operations training. I'm a desk clerk with 8 months of administrative experience. Why would you consider me for something like this?" Major Chun answered the question. "Private Morrison, elite Special Forces soldiers are trained to excel within established parameters. They're extremely effective when operating as part of a team, following detailed plans, and executing missions with clear objectives and defined support structures. But this mission requires someone who can operate completely outside normal parameters." Colonel Mitchell continued the explanation. "Your psychological profile suggests you have developed exactly the kind of independent thinking and adaptability we need. Your administrative work has taught you to process complex information, identify patterns, and make decisions without constant guidance. Most importantly, you've learned to function effectively while being essentially invisible, which is exactly what this mission requires. Additionally," General Kellerman added, "your injury actually provides certain advantages. You've already proven that you can adapt to limitations and find alternative solutions when conventional approaches aren't available. You're not carrying the psychological burden of an impressive combat record that might make you overconfident or prone to unnecessary risks." Danny absorbed this information, realizing they had identified qualities in him that he hadn't fully recognized in himself. But he also understood the enormous gap between his current capabilities and what the mission would require. "Ma'am, even if my psychological profile is suitable, I don't have the technical training for this kind of operation. I've never conducted reconnaissance in hostile territory. I don't have advanced weapons training or survival certification." "That can be addressed," Mitchell replied. "If you agree to volunteer, you would undergo an intensive 6-week training program designed specifically for this mission. We would provide advanced marksmanship instruction, wilderness survival training, intelligence gathering techniques, and everything else you would need." General Kellerman leaned forward. "Private Morrison, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a completely honest answer. Are you willing to volunteer for a mission that has a very low probability of survival, no guarantee of recognition, even if successful, and would require you to risk everything for your country?" Danny felt the weight of the moment settling over him. This was the kind of decision that defined a person's entire life, regardless of the outcome. He thought about the 8 months he had spent behind a desk, feeling like his military service had become meaningless. He thought about the opportunity to prove that he could contribute something significant to his country's security. Most importantly, he thought about the lives that might be saved if this terror cell was disrupted before they could execute whatever attack they were planning. "Ma'am, I need to understand one thing. If I volunteer for this mission, am I doing it because I'm actually the best person for the job, or am I doing it because nobody else was willing to step forward?" The question seemed to surprise all 3 officers. After a moment, Major Chun answered thoughtfully. Private Morrison, that's an excellent question that demonstrates exactly the kind of analytical thinking we need for this mission. The honest answer is both. The soldiers who refused to volunteer this morning are not cowards, but they're also not the right psychological fit for this particular operation. Your administrative experience, your adaptability, and your ability to function independently make you uniquely qualified, regardless of your lack of conventional special operations training. Colonel Mitchell added, sometimes the best person for an unconventional mission is someone who thinks unconventionally. Your approach to problem solving is different from typical special forces methodology, and that difference might be exactly what this mission requires. Danny considered their words for several minutes, weighing the enormous risks against the potential impact of the mission. Finally, he made his decision. Ma'am, I volunteer for the mission. General Kellerman nodded approvingly. Very well, Private Morrison. You'll begin specialized training tomorrow morning at 0500 hours. Until then, you're confined to base and prohibited from discussing this conversation with anyone. Your administrative duties are suspended, and you'll report directly to Major Chun for the duration of your training program. As Danny prepared to leave the conference room, Colonel Mitchell called him back. Private Morrison, one more thing. Tomorrow morning, when your training begins, you might encounter some resistance from the instructors and other personnel. Many of them will question why a desk clerk was selected for this mission instead of more experienced soldiers. How do you plan to handle that situation? Danny thought about the question, then answered with more confidence than he felt. Sir, I plan to focus on learning everything I can and proving through performance that the selection was justified. I can't control what other people think about my qualifications, but I can control how hard I work to earn their respect. The three officers exchanged glances, and General Kellerman smiled for the first time since Danny had met her. That's exactly the right answer, Private Morrison. I think we made the right choice. As Danny walked back to his quarters that evening, he couldn't help but reflect on how dramatically his life had changed in a single day. That morning, he had been a forgotten desk clerk processing routine paperwork. Now he was preparing for the most dangerous mission of his military career, selected personally by one of the most respected generals in the Army. The irony wasn't lost on him. After 8 months of being overlooked and underestimated, he was finally being asked to prove himself in the most extreme way possible. The question was whether he would be able to transform from administrative clerk to special operations soldier in just 6 weeks, and whether the qualities that had made him successful behind a desk would translate to success in the mountains of Afghanistan. That night, Danny lay awake thinking about Tank Thompson and the other soldiers who had refused to volunteer. He didn't blame them for their decision. They were experienced enough to recognize an extremely dangerous mission when they saw one. But Danny also realized that their experience might actually be a disadvantage in this situation. They knew too much about what could go wrong, while he was naive enough to believe that anything was possible with enough preparation and determination. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Danny's last conscious thought was about the terrorist cell operating in the Afghan mountains, planning attacks against American interests. In 6 weeks, he would be walking into their territory alone, carrying nothing but his training and his determination to succeed. The transformation from desk clerk to special operative was about to begin. Danny's alarm sounded at 0430 hours. Though he'd been awake for the past hour, staring at the ceiling and mentally preparing for whatever training awaited him. As he dressed in standard PT gear, he wondered if he had made the biggest mistake of his life or taken the first step toward proving his true potential. The training facility was located in a restricted section of the base that Danny had never accessed before. Security checkpoints and warning signs made it clear that this area was reserved for classified operations. At exactly 0500 hours, Danny reported to Building 7, where he found Major Chun waiting along with 3 instructors he didn't recognize. Private Morrison, Major Chun said, "Meet your training team. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos will handle your weapons and tactical training. Master Sergeant David Kim specializes in survival and reconnaissance techniques. Captain Robert Hayes will oversee your intelligence gathering and analysis instruction. Danny studied the three instructors, immediately recognizing that these were elite soldiers with extensive special operations experience. Sergeant Santos was compact and muscular, with the calm confidence of someone who had survived multiple combat deployments. Master Sergeant Kim moved with the fluid efficiency of a soldier who had learned to conserve energy for when it really mattered. Captain Hayes had the sharp, analytical eyes of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions based on incomplete information. Private Morrison, Sergeant Santos said, "I'm going to be direct with you. When I was told I'd be training a desk clerk for a solo infiltration mission, I thought someone was playing a practical joke. I've trained Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and Delta Force operatives. I've never been asked to prepare someone with your background for this level of operation." Danny met her gaze steadily. "Sergeant, I understand your concerns. All I can tell you is that I'm here to learn everything you can teach me, and I'll work harder than any trainee you've ever had." Master Sergeant Kim stepped forward. "Morrison, this isn't about working hard. Plenty of soldiers work hard and still get killed in situations they're not prepared for. This is about developing instincts and capabilities that normally take years to acquire. We have 6 weeks to accomplish something that usually requires 6 years of progressive training. Which is why," Captain Hayes added, "we're going to use unconventional training methods designed specifically for your psychological profile and the unique requirements of this mission. You're not going to train like a typical Special Forces operative because you're not going to operate like a typical Special Forces operative." The first week of training nearly broke Danny's spirit. The physical demands were beyond anything he had experienced, even during basic training. Each day began with a 5-mile run in full gear, followed by weapons training that required him to achieve expert-level proficiency with multiple firearm systems. Afternoons were devoted to survival skills, where he learned to navigate by stars, find water in desert conditions, and create shelter using minimal resources. But the most challenging aspect wasn't physical, it was psychological. The instructors constantly subjected Danny to stress scenarios designed to test his decision-making under pressure. They would present him with complex tactical problems, give him insufficient information, and demand immediate solutions. When he made mistakes, they forced him to analyze his errors and develop alternative approaches. "Morrison," Sergeant Santos said during the second week, "your marksmanship has improved dramatically, but you're still thinking like someone who expects backup to arrive if things go wrong. On this mission, there is no backup. Every decision you make has to account for the possibility that you're completely on your own." Master Sergeant Kim was equally demanding during survival training. "Stop looking for the easy solution," he told Danny after a particularly frustrating exercise in water procurement. "In hostile territory, the easy solution is usually a trap. You need to develop the patience to find the safe solution, even when you're exhausted and desperate." Captain Hayes focused on intelligence analysis and reconnaissance techniques. "Morrison, your administrative background actually gives you an advantage here. You're accustomed to processing large amounts of information and identifying relevant patterns. But you need to learn to do that analysis quickly, under stress, and with incomplete data." By the third week, Danny began to notice changes in himself that went beyond improved physical conditioning. His reflexes had sharpened, his situational awareness had expanded, and his decision-making had become more instinctive. More importantly, he was developing the kind of mental resilience that allowed him to function effectively even when everything seemed to be going wrong. The breakthrough came during a complex exercise in the fourth week. The instructors had created a scenario where Danny was required to infiltrate a mock enemy compound, gather specific intelligence, and escape undetected. Previous attempts had ended in failure, with Danny either being captured by the opposing force or failing to obtain the required information. This time, however, Danny approached the problem differently. Instead of trying to replicate tactics he had seen in movies or learn from his instructors, he drew upon his administrative experience and analytical skills. He spent hours observing the mock compound from a distance, identifying patterns in guard rotations, noting vulnerabilities in their communication procedures, and developing a plan that relied on patience and precision rather than speed and aggression. The infiltration was successful. Danny obtained the required intelligence and escaped without detection, using techniques that impressed even his experienced instructors. Morrison, Sergeant Santos, said after the exercise, "That was some of the best tactical thinking I've seen from any trainee. You approached that compound like you were solving an administrative problem rather than executing a military operation, and it worked perfectly." Master Sergeant Kim was equally complimentary. "You've learned to use your analytical strengths instead of trying to overcome them. That's exactly the kind of adaptation that will keep you alive in hostile territory." The final 2 weeks of training focused on mission-specific preparation. Danny learned about the specific terrorist cell he would be targeting, studied satellite imagery of the Afghan mountain region where they were located, and practiced with the exact equipment he would carry during the operation. General Kellerman visited the training facility during the final week, observing Danny's progress and conducting additional evaluations with the instruction team. After watching Danny execute a complex surveillance exercise, she pulled him aside for a private conversation. "Private Morrison, your instructors tell me you've exceeded all expectations during training. More importantly, you've developed an operational methodology that's uniquely suited to this mission. Are you ready for deployment?" Danny considered the question carefully. 6 weeks ago, he had been filing paperwork and processing routine administrative requests. Now he was preparing to infiltrate a terrorist compound in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. The transformation still seemed surreal, but he felt confident in his abilities and committed to the mission's success. "Ma'am, I'm ready." 3 days later, Danny found himself on a military transport aircraft, flying toward Afghanistan under a cover identity that listed him as a communications technician being deployed for routine equipment maintenance. His real mission orders were sealed and encrypted, accessible only through secure channels that would be activated once he reached the forward operating base near the mission area. During the long flight, Danny reflected on the events that had brought him to this point. 6 weeks ago, Tank Thompson and 24 other elite soldiers had refused to volunteer for this mission. They had evaluated the risks, considered their own capabilities, and decided that the probability of success was too low to justify the risk. Danny still didn't know if they had been right or wrong in their assessment. What he did know was that his own psychological profile and unique combination of skills had created an opportunity that wouldn't have existed for a conventional special forces operative. His administrative experience had taught him to approach complex problems from unexpected angles. His months of being overlooked and underestimated had given him the humility to focus on preparation rather than bravado. Most importantly, his lack of extensive combat experience meant he wasn't carrying preconceptions about what was possible or impossible in hostile territory. As the aircraft approached Afghan airspace, Danny began his final mental preparation for the mission. In 72 hours, he would be inserted into the mountains near the terrorist compound, carrying minimal equipment and operating completely alone. Everything would depend on his ability to apply 6 weeks of intensive training to a real-world scenario where mistakes would have lethal consequences. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. General Kellerman had demanded a volunteer from among the base's most elite soldiers, and when none stepped forward, she had ultimately selected a desk clerk who had volunteered not because he was fearless, but because he was analytical enough to understand what the mission really required. Tank Thompson and the others had been right about one thing. This was an extremely dangerous operation with a low probability of success. But they had been wrong about who was best qualified to attempt it. Sometimes the most unconventional problems require the most unconventional solutions. As the aircraft began its descent toward the forward operating base, Danny reviewed his mission parameters one final time. Intelligence gathering was the primary objective, but If the opportunity presented itself, he was authorized to eliminate key leadership targets to disrupt the terrorist cell's operational capabilities. 3 weeks from now, he would either be extracted successfully with intelligence that could prevent future terrorist attacks, or he would disappear into the Afghan mountains, another casualty of America's ongoing war against terrorism. General Kellerman had been honest about those possibilities from the beginning. But Danny had also come to understand something during his training that none of the experienced soldiers who had refused to volunteer seemed to grasp. Sometimes the greatest victory came not from having the best odds of success, but from being willing to accept responsibility when success really mattered. The transport aircraft touched down at the forward operating base as the sun set over the Afghan mountains. Danny gathered his gear and prepared to take the final steps toward a mission that would either validate General Kellerman's faith in unconventional solutions or serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of selecting inexperienced personnel for elite operations. Either way, the desk clerk who had volunteered when battle-hardened sergeants refused was about to discover what he was truly capable of when everything depended on his ability to adapt, survive, and succeed completely on his own.